Good afternoon, pilot teachers, and good afternoon, students. Thank you. Sit down. Okay, we have to recap on what we have covered so far. We have looked at the tropical climates, and from the tropical climates, the notes that we have made note of already, we have looked at the equatorial climate, its location, and some of the characteristics. Savanna or tropical continental climate, the location of this climate and characteristics. We've also looked at the tropical monsoon, location of the tropical monsoon climate and some of the characteristics. The tropical maritime climate or the east coast climate, the characteristics and also the location. We started off with the desert in our last lesson as the last of the examples of tropical climate, but we did not get to look at the rest of the information on desert. So today, we are going to continue on with our work on climate. We will complete looking at the characteristics of desert climate, location, and also listing some examples that you were supposed to also find for your homework. And then we will move on to looking at the next major grouping, and those are the temperate climates. And for the temperate climates, we might have time to look at only the warm temperate eastern maritime climate and the Mediterranean climate, which is also known as the warm temperate western margin climate. If we have time, we'll continue on. Otherwise, then I think we might stop where the Mediterranean climate is. And for Mediterranean and the warm temperate eastern margin, they are now examples of the next grouping, and that is the temperate climates. But before we move on to the temperate climates, let's conclude our work on the tropical climates, and let's look at the rest of the information for the desert environment and desert climate. Okay, the information from the monitor, that is what we have already started on in our last lesson. That serves as our introduction, and I'll go through it again. From the monitor, it says, with a transitional semi-desert area surrounding them, hot desert climates are found on the poleward sides of the tropical savannas in the latitudes of 15 degrees to 30 degrees north and south of the equator. Tropical deserts extend across continents, but away from the east coast locations. That is a very important characteristic that we must also note. They are dry because of prevailing high pressure systems in these latitudes, and winds that occur are easterlies, which have dropped their moisture on the east coast before reaching these areas. So one can say that hot deserts of the world are generally located between 15 degrees to 30 degrees north and south of the equator on the western sides of continents. On the same latitude on the eastern sides of continents sits the tropical maritime climate. On the western side sits the hot deserts. Your homework was for you to at least look at atlases or maps to find names of some tropical deserts. And the map that we have on our monitor can give us some idea on the location of those deserts. The only problem with that map is that it does not give us the names of those deserts. So it is your task now to give me some names of the deserts, and perhaps the red color on the map should be able to help you identify or name some of those deserts. Okay, we'll start with Luisa. Can you at least name a couple of deserts that you might have researched on for your homework or made a list of for your homework? Some deserts to tell us those are areas that experience the hot desert or tropical desert type climate.
The Sahara Desert on the African continent.
Okay, the Sahara Desert here in the African continent. Okay, good. Any others?
In Australia, there's the Great Sandy Desert and the Great Victoria Desert. That's the Gibson Desert in Australia.
Okay, so those deserts as mentioned in Australia. the red color here representing that, the Great Sandy Desert, Simpson Desert, the Great Victorian Desert, examples of names given to the desert area in Australia. Any others?
And the Kalahari Desert also in
Okay,
Africa.
Kalahari in Africa. Okay. Any others beside the deserts that Luisa has mentioned? Doreen, any others that you can also add to the list?
The Gobi Desert. The Gobi Desert.
Okay, we're looking at the Gobi Desert. What would be the difference then with the Gobi Desert to what we are actually making reference or note on? Shelley?
It's beyond 30 degrees, no?
Okay, it would definitely, yes, beyond 30 degrees. Therefore, it will not be a hot desert. Rather, it would be a cold desert. Even though we have the deserts, which are also cold deserts that are indicated on the map, we have to be able to identify that the characteristics of the desert areas would be similar, very similar. The only difference is that the location of those deserts. If they are not within the tropical areas between perhaps 25 to say 30 degrees, then they are not within the location, then they are not hot deserts. But if they are within those particular locations, 25 to about 30 or 15 degrees to about 30, then they are considered as hot deserts. So the Gobi Desert is definitely correct. It is a desert. The only difference with it is a cold desert, not a hot desert. And the Gobi Desert would be located along this area here. Similar to perhaps the Atacama Desert in South America. The Atacama Desert would be another example of perhaps a cooler desert compared to those that are found within the tropical areas or region. Okay, let's look at the summary now of the work that we have covered on tropical deserts, and you will be required to at least make note of that information. I'll give you at least 5 minutes, but before you go ahead with the copying of that information, let's look at the summary for the hot desert and the semi-desert. We start with the temperature. Temperatures in the desert in summer is very hot, in winter it is warm. Precipitation in the desert areas, very low, usually less than 250 millimeters per year. Seasonal, we're looking at, in terms of precipitation, it is dry in all seasons in the hot deserts. The controls for the hot desert and semi-desert climate, prevailing high pressure systems, or the dry continental air masses bringing little rain anytime to those areas. You must also remember from what we have covered on pressure belts, at 30 degrees north and south of the equator sits the high pressure belt. And that high pressure is always associated with dry conditions. So along those areas, 30 degrees north and south, you can expect to also find most of the hot deserts, especially on the western sides of continents. Okay, you have 5 minutes now to make note of that into your exercise book. Okay, we made note of that information, the summary of the desert climates. Everyone? Okay, good. Let's look at the climograph showing us an example of a desert type climate. Okay, looking at the climograph, you could be able to easily pick up that that particular climograph is for a desert area by simply looking at the rainfall. Rainfall right throughout the year less than 250 millimeters. You can have hardly any rain at all or maybe very little rainfall. And then you have to also double check with the temperatures. For it to be the tropical hot deserts, temperatures must be between, say for example, between 10 degrees to about 35 degrees Celsius. So during the day, it can get very, very hot. Temperatures can be very high. During the night, it can get very cold. Temperatures can go well below. So a big range in the temperatures during the day, the desert area being very hot, and also during the night, maybe the temperatures being very low, can tell you that perhaps that particular climograph is for a desert area. But the main thing to look for is the total annual rainfall. Hardly any rain at all or very little rainfall. And if it is very little, then it has to be less than 250 per annum or per year. Okay, so here we have an example of Phoenix, a desert area or region in United States or in USA. Any questions with regards to information we've looked at on tropical deserts or hot deserts? Okay, if there are no questions, then we are going to move on. And we'll move on this time away from the tropical regions now, and we are in the temperate regions. One of the common characteristics that we are able to actually identify for the temperate regions is usually the 4 seasons that they experience. So we are moving away now from 23.5 degrees north and 23.5 degrees south of the equator, and we are moving towards the poles, the North Pole and the South Poles. Temperate climates, similar to what we have done on the tropical climates, temperate climates can be further subdivided into the 5 main climatic types or 5 main climatic groups. Even though within the temperate regions, there are also further subdivisions of climate depending on local variations. And when we talk about local variations, a classic or a very good example is when we looked at the tropical climates and when we looked at the monsoon climates, whereby we found that the monsoon climate is only restricted or located in a specific region of the world and it does not cover everywhere else. Similarly, when we look at the temperate climates, there may be modifications or variations, but here we have the 5 main groupings of climates that can be found within the temperate regions. Okay, looking at those 5 groupings then, we have the warm temperate eastern maritime or margin climate. We have the Mediterranean or the warm temperate western margin climate. We have the cool temperate western maritime climate. Then there is the cool temperate continental climate. And there is the cool temperate eastern continental climate. It's a little bit confusing because some of the names are very, very close or similar. Words like hot and cold and cool makes a big difference in the type of climate that we are actually studying. And for most of the temperate climates, they are not actually cold climates because the cold climates will be the polar climates. You will note that most of the temperate climates are warm to cool climates. Again, their location, whether they are on the eastern side or the western sides of the continent or in the interior of continents, will vary and make a difference in terms of the characteristics. So let's look at those temperate climates now. Points to remember on temperate climates, they are found in the middle latitudes of the world. The low latitudes are the tropical climates. The high latitudes will be the polar climates. The middle latitude will be the temperate climates. So the temperate climates are found in the middle latitudes of the world. Here, solar radiation is less intense than in the tropical regions. And all of these climates, they tend to have cool to cold winters. At least 1 month with an average temperature below 15 degrees Celsius. All of those regions which experience the temperate type climate come under the influence of both tropical air masses and polar air masses. So the warm air coming from the equator blowing towards that area can contribute also to variation in the climate. At the same time, the cold air masses coming from the poles towards that area can also have an influence on the climate. Note that there are 5 major temperate climates which can be recognized within the temperate group. We'll move on. Let's look at the first now example of the warm temperate, of the temperate climates, and this is the warm temperate or the subtropical eastern maritime climate. So we're looking at this climate now. Let's look at the location and also the characteristic for this particular climate. The warm temperate eastern maritime climate. The word eastern will already tell you that those climates are supposed to be found on the eastern sides of continent, but they have to be within the temperate regions of the world. And regions with this type of climate, they lie on the eastern margins of continents in the latitudes of approximately 25 degrees to 35 degrees north and south of the equator. Remember, once we reach 23.5 degrees and we move away from 23.5 degrees towards the poles, then we are already away from the tropical areas. So for the warm temperate eastern maritime or margin type climate, they are found between 25 to 35 degrees north and south of the equator. These regions, the warm temperate eastern maritime climate, they experience hot summers and cool winters with a moderate to heavy all-season rainfall. Okay, again, if you don't copy down everything that is there, the summary, I'll give you time to make note of the summary, and from the summary, most of that information will already be presented. Okay, we'll move on. Other information on the warm temperate eastern maritime climate. The moist maritime air masses prevail as air flows largely onshore from the east in these particular latitudes, bringing orographic rainfall. While tropical maritime air masses prevail in summer, some cyclonic rainfall often occurs in winter, and rainfall tend to decrease inland, and winters become cooler the further one is from the sea. That is looking at the warm temperate eastern maritime climate. You might be wondering, why is it that the tropical maritime air masses is actually in there? You note the location of this particular climate. It's on the eastern sides of continent, 25 to about 35. So the trade winds are also going to be effective within that region. And the trade winds are coming from the southeast. And from the southeast, if it is in the southern hemisphere, they will be bringing with them a lot of rain from the sea, moisture from the sea bringing in a lot of rain. So in summer, it says there, in summer, the tropical maritime air masses prevail. Therefore, there are also some cyclonic rainfall that often occurs, but the cyclonic rainfall that occurs would be usually in winter. Another important characteristic of this type of climate is that rainfall tends to decrease as you go inland, away from the coastline. And not only that, winters, especially in such a climatic area, tends to be cooler the further you go away from the sea. Let's look at the location of the warm temperate eastern maritime climate. Okay, we look at the location of those climatic types, examples in red, in this section here, this area. Okay, if you had to make a list, maybe you might also want to make note of this. Make a list of some of those areas. We start off from New Zealand. In New Zealand, you can note it is the North Island in New Zealand that would usually experience the warm temperate eastern maritime type climate. The North Island in New Zealand is one of those areas that experiences such climate. Okay, beside the North Island in New Zealand, we also have in Australia, the southeastern part of Australia. This section here, the southeastern part of Australia experiences this type of climate. You also have the southeastern and also South Africa. The southeastern part of Africa also experiences this type of climate. You have southern Brazil, this area here, southern Brazil, sorry, not on the western side, it's this area here. And Uruguay in South America, they experience also this type of climate. Then we have Central Eastern Asia, Central Eastern China that also experiences this type of climate, this section here. In Japan, the southern part of the islands in Japan also experience this type of climate. And finally, we have the southeastern part of United States or USA. So these are some of the regions of the world that experiences the warm eastern maritime type climate. If we have to check their location, they are also located between 25 to about 35 degrees north and south of the equator, mainly on the eastern sides of continents. Okay, now to the summary points. I will now allow you at least 5 minutes to make note of the summary points. But again, before we do that, we note the temperature in the warm temperate eastern maritime type climate. Summer is hot, winter is cool. Precipitation, moderate to heavy, and rainfall is usually more than 700 millimeters per annum or per year. In terms of seasonal, rain is experienced or precipitation is experienced in all the seasons. Controls of the warm temperate eastern maritime climate, the moist onshore easterly maritime air in all seasons, bringing orographic rain and also some cyclonic rain in winter.
Six minutes.
14. Okay, all made note of that information? Okay, and perhaps we have so time only to look at one more of the temperate climates, and we look at the Mediterranean. Okay, let's move on. The next of the temperate climates now are the Mediterranean, but before we do that, perhaps a sample of a climograph for Sydney, which is a classic example of the warm temperate eastern maritime climate. And looking at the climograph, this is what the climograph would actually look like. The moderate rainfall throughout the year, 700 millimeters plus. And also we have, here you can see a distinct drop in the temperature, or you can have a distinct bump in the temperature, because we are moving further away now from the equator, and you are able to tell whether that area is in the southern hemisphere or in the northern hemisphere according to the bump and the dip in the temperature reading. But because Sydney is in the southern hemisphere, we have a dip in the temperature of this particular area. Note, temperatures range from about 10 to 21 or 22 degrees. So temperatures are not as hot as we would expect them to be in the tropical regions. We are in the temperate regions, so the temperatures now are warm to cool for this type of climatic type. Okay, let's move on now to looking at the Mediterranean. The next temperate climate now is that of the Mediterranean. Another word that we use to describing the Mediterranean climate is also known as the warm temperate western margin. So if they talk about the warm temperate western margin climate, we are also making reference to the Mediterranean type climate. In a lot of books, they might not tell you it's Mediterranean. They might use the term warm temperate western margin. For as long as it is warm temperate western margin, then it is Mediterranean type climate. Some of the characteristics of this type of climate, again, I'm going to give you time to make note of the summary. If you'd like to make note of some of the information there, perhaps do it in note form so you don't have to copy everything word by word. This type of climate, the Mediterranean type climate, is found on the western sides of continents in the latitudes of 30 to 45 degrees north and about 30 to 40 degrees to the south. These areas, if we look at them carefully and we go back to what we have studied on the tropical climates and the other climatic types, they actually lie between the hot deserts and the wet, cool, temperate climates that lie on the west coast, on the sides towards the poles. Like the savannas, the Mediterranean climate experience one of the neighboring climates in summer and the other one in winter. Because they lie in between the deserts and the wet, cool, temperate climates, they obviously experience climate types similar to the desert in summer and climate types similar to the wet, cool, temperate areas in winter. With that information alone, it might not be enough to give us enough information on recognizing the Mediterranean climate, but the location is important. 30 degrees to 45 north, 30 degrees to 40 to the south, mainly on the western sides of continents. The Mediterranean climate is unique. Why? Because in the Mediterranean climate, summers are hot and very dry and sunny, while the winters are cool and wet. This characteristic is actually very important because if you were given a climograph, you can automatically pick up that a climograph belongs to the Mediterranean, because Mediterranean climates will always have their summers dry with no rain at all, whereas when it is cold or when it is very cold in winter, they experience the highest amount of rainfall. Later on, when we look at that climograph of an example of the Mediterranean, then I'll explain further on what I mean when I'm looking at summers are hot and dry and winters are cold and wet. Note also, the Mediterranean regions are the only regions in the world to have wet winters and dry summers. So when it is very cold, there'll definitely be rain. And that's the only region in the world that experiences such. The belts of subtropical highs that bring drought to the deserts, they shift to these areas during their summer and continue to bring dry weather. That is also another important point, and it will come together with the controls when we come to looking at the summary. When the pressure belts shift back in winter, these regions then experience the belt of westerlies, with the onshore maritime air masses usually bringing in orographic rainfall. Also in those regions, there may be some cyclonic rainfall that can occur. Let's look at some of the regions of the world that experiences the Mediterranean type climate. You might want to also make note of it. The areas here that are found around the Mediterranean Sea, they experience the Mediterranean type climate. So all of these countries here, which borders the Mediterranean Sea, experiences the Mediterranean type climate. In Australia, you also have the southwestern part of Australia and Adelaide that experiences the Mediterranean type climate. You have South Africa that also experiences the Mediterranean type climate. We have southern Chile in South America that experiences this type of climate, and also in the United States, California, that experiences the Mediterranean type climate. Okay, for California, it is the central and the southern part of California that experiences this type of climate. So all those areas that are in red, they do experience the Mediterranean type climate. Let's look at the summary now for this particular climate, the Mediterranean. Okay, temperatures for the Mediterranean climate: summer is hot, winter is cool. Precipitation, moderate, more than 700 millimeters per year, that's amount of rainfall. Seasonal, very important, dry summers, wet winters. That's a main characteristic that you should be able to pick up for the Mediterranean climate. The controls for this climate here: high pressure systems or dry continental air masses, they bring summer drought. The moist onshore westerly maritime air masses, they bring rain in winter, especially. Okay, I'll give you at least 5 minutes to make note now of the summary. Six. Have we made note now of that information, everyone? Okay, to finish off then, what we have actually looked at, let's look at the climograph, an example of the climograph for the Mediterranean or the warm temperate western margin type climate. Remember I mentioned that when it is winter, you can see the dip in the temperature here. That's when a lot of rain falls. When it is summer, the bump on the temperature will tell you that, and hardly any rain falling or very little rain falling during the summer months. So the characteristics again, note, summer is actually dry and hot, winter is cold and wet. And that's an important characteristic that we need to be aware of for the Mediterranean type climate. Okay, with that information also, that also brings us now to the end of our lesson. Class, if you can stand up, please. Okay, to the pilot teachers, our keyword for lesson 128 is deserts. Sorry, desert. Good afternoon and thank you, class.